Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is our Climate Science 101 lecture with Dr. Chip Fletcher. It's my pleasure to introduce Chip Fletcher. Chip is the interim dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's also chairperson of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission, a prominent public speaker and contributor to local and national media. Chip's research and teaching focus is on climate change, coastal community resiliency, and natural coastal systems. In addition to advising over 30 graduate research degrees in earth and planetary sciences, Chip has received a number of teaching, research, and community service awards for his work in service to government agencies and public groups. Beyond his very impressive professional accolades, Chip is also a great friend of the Terra Do community. I was looking at our YouTube history earlier today, and as far as I can tell, I think this is going to be your 11th Climate Science 101 lecture for our community,
all right,
which is pretty incredible. There's been some other events like IPCC report talks and such that you've joined us for as well. So we always appreciate having you here and telling us it how it is like it is. So thank you so much. I will pass it off to you, Chip, with no further ado.
Thanks everybody for being here. And let me do a share screen and get my PowerPoint up. All right. So I'm going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and let me apologize in advance. My therapy for ecological despair, which is an actual psychosis that has been written about. I can show you a paper in Nature Climate Change from, I think it's 2018, identifying ecological despair as a psychosis that affects climate scientists first, but eventually people who really get into the depth of climate change and understand the severity of the issue all sort of go into this phase of grief or despair. And I'm just going to let you know up front, that's my objective. And number one, it's my therapy. The solution to despair or grief is action. So this is one of the things I take action on. Number two, you need to know how bad the situation in order to feel the true motivation for us to get out of it. And this is a pivotal decade. Certainly, climate change has no end line. We can't stop in 2030 if we are not successful at stopping warming at 1.5 degrees or cutting our greenhouse gases by 48 or 50%, which are sort of the steps on the pathway. We can't stop if we fail to achieve those. We can never stop. We have to keep on battling climate change, even as we fail to make some of these benchmarks. But it's not just about climate change. It's also about destroying the world's natural places and causing biodiversity loss, unleashing pathogens from these natural ecosystems that are disturbed by humanity, and creating an era of pandemics that we are now in. And the amplified feedback system of human communities that are at the low end of the equity range, that are poorly resourced, that are at low socioeconomic status and least responsible for these problems are the ones that get hit the hardest and recover the slowest and are less and less ready for the continued shocks related to the extreme weather events that come with climate change. And there's another global issue, which is pollution, but I'm not going to get into that. But we are facing this range of global crises, and they all interfinger with each other. Climate change certainly magnifies all of these, and we can address all of them through the lens of climate change here. But we can't ignore any one of these because they don't live in isolation. So we can begin with this NASA data set on the annual average temperature since the late 1800s, which is taken to be the pre-industrial period. Jim Hansen, former chief scientist at Goddard Institute of Space Studies and a premier modeler of climate change, is now speculating that the last 6 or 7 years, we are seeing an acceleration in the rate of warming. And an acceleration in the rate of warming may be in part due to carbon contributions from the natural system, not purely from continued greenhouse gas emissions from humans, but the potential breakdown of different natural carbon sinks, such as the tropical rainforest. And we're gonna dwell on that a little bit today. And of course, this is our record of carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide is the key greenhouse gas because it has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere. Methane has a much shorter lifetime. Some of the other greenhouse gases are more powerful than carbon dioxide, but they cycle out. Once we decide to stop the sources of these other powerful greenhouse gases, they will cycle out within a few decades. Carbon dioxide is very long-lived, and we actually really must move much, much faster on sort of the third pillar of climate change, which is sequestration, right? We have mitigation, adaptation, and sequestration. I would also propose a fourth pillar, which is human equity. But the third pillar of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is something that we are moving very slowly on, and that needs to change. And the rate of CO2 growth in the atmosphere, when we first began measuring it, which actually extends back earlier than this graph, which was in the late 1950s with David Keeling, the rate of growth was less than 1 part per million per year, but now the rate of growth is 2.5 parts per million per year. So CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere is accelerating. And we reached, in the last year or two, we reached 420 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is more than 50% greater than the pre-industrial level. So we've sort of crossed this 50% increase threshold. And more than half of all the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions have occurred since 1988. And it was in the summer of 1988 or 87, I can't remember exactly, when Jim Hansen, that scientist from NASA, testified before Congress that he was certain at this point that climate change was real and that we were seeing the effects. Well, the management of global climate change is now been taken on by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is an organization in the UN, the UNFCCC it's called. They hold annual meetings that are called conferences of parties or COPs. And so you hear about the COP every year. I just attended my first COP, which was in Scotland, Glasgow, Scotland, in November of last year. The next one is going to be in Egypt. At these COPs, the world's nations make certain agreements. And in the 2015 COP in Paris, the world signed on to a Paris Agreement to stop global warming before it reached 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to end warming before it reaches 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit may not strike you as much of a temperature increase. In fact, when you walk outside from the sunlight to under the shade of a tree and back to the sunlight, you're experiencing more than 3.6 degrees change in temperature. That's not the appropriate analogy. The appropriate analogy is your body temperature, your core temperature. If you're running a low-grade fever of 101 degrees, that's equivalent to warming of 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. 98.6 plus 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, you're up to 101 basically. And if we get to 103-degree body temperature, 105-degree high-grade fever, it becomes life-threatening. And I can tell you right now that the national policies around the world for emitting greenhouse gases has us on that pathway. That's a pathway towards 3 degrees Celsius net warming since the pre-industrial period, or a high-grade, dangerous hospital style fever in a human. That's the proper analogy. And with this declaration in 2015 of working hard to stop warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, then in 2018, the IPCC, which is also a United Nations effort, plus the World Meteorological Organization, came out with a study. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they actually analyzed and modeled, well, what would the world look like at warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, the conclusions are warming will persist for centuries to millennia. There'll be increases in hot extremes, floods, droughts, sea level rise, species loss. The oceans will continue to lose dissolved oxygen. They'll grow more acidic. They will warm. Terrestrial biodiversity, marine biodiversity, decreased food and water security, decreased human safety, increased human inequality. All of this list of severe negative impacts, all with warming that we have probably effectively already passed. Even though our warming is on the order of 1.2 degrees C, there's inertia in the climate system, and if we stopped all our greenhouse gas emissions today, warming would still continue for about 20 years before it finally stopped. And so 1.5 degrees has essentially already been crossed. So what is our progress since the last COP in Glasgow in November on stopping warming? Well, on the bottom axis here, we have the last decade from 2010 up to present day, and then on to mid-century to 2050. And on the vertical axis, we have carbon dioxide emissions in billions of tons of CO2, known as gigatons. And this is the history of carbon dioxide emissions over the past decade. 2019 was a record-setting year where, if you include CO2 plus methane and other greenhouse gases, we emitted over 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, is how we phrase it, greenhouse gases. Then we went into the recession associated with the COVID pandemic. Equivalent emissions fell by almost 5.5%. And then last year, as we emerged from the pandemic and as the world's economies, as the world governments invested funds, support funding into rejuvenating their economies to come out from the recession, we saw a spin up again of the fossil fuel machinery around the world. And we almost recovered our 2019 emissions. So 2021 emissions went back up 4.9% compared to 2020. And the pathway to stopping warming means reducing emissions, and it looks like this. So this green line is the line we need to follow on our emissions. We need to reach net zero by 2050. And based on all the most recent promises of the world's nations to the UNFCCC in Glasgow, this is the pathway that we're on. So this is announced promises for cutting back greenhouse gas emissions. It puts us on a pathway of 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But what is promised is different than what the governments individually are actually investing in. And the publicly announced investments of individual governments, the turning on of the fossil fuel economy again, all of that, if you assess it, actually takes us on a pathway to over 3 degrees Celsius. And this difference between promises and actuality is well known, and every year this gap comes out as a report called the GAP report that the UNFCCC releases. And it's all about the difference between what governments are promising to do in terms of cutting emissions and what they're actually doing, which is failing to. But that's not all. During the Glasgow meeting, the Washington Post released an in-depth study of the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and found that on average emissions are underreported by 23%. Right, so there's this underreporting taking place. And we learned about 2 months ago, methane emissions, a very powerful greenhouse gas, are underreported by about 70%, 70%. Methane is responsible for around 30% of global warming. It dissipates faster than carbon dioxide, but it's much more powerful. And cutting methane emissions would have a rapid effect on limiting global warming, but we are underreporting methane emissions by 70%. None of those are taken into account in the UNFCCC reporting. And neither is what I'm about to tell you. Now, in an average year, about 86% of our CO2 comes from burning fossil fuels, and about 14% comes from land use, like deforestation, basically destroying the carbon storage that is in soils and in the biome, the terrestrial biome. And of these sources of CO2, about 46% goes into the atmosphere and traps heat that would otherwise escape to space, causing global warming. About 31% is absorbed by photosynthesis on land, acting on our behalf. And about 23% is dissolved in the ocean, creating or lowering the pH, creating what's known as ocean acidification. CO2 and H2O combine to make what's known as carbonic acid, H2CO3. It's a very light acid, so that's where ocean acidification comes from. So this middle terrestrial biome component in the budget is critically important, but it is beginning to fail. So this paper tells us, it came out in Science, which is a premier journal, and it says plant photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the air. It's part of plant metabolism. The other half of plant metabolism is respiration, where plants release CO2 to the air. And photosynthesis has a heat limit, a thermal maximum. And when the air heats beyond this thermal maximum, photosynthesis sharply declines, but respiration continues to increase. And so you get the terrestrial biome, you get the photosynthetic community on land becoming a source of carbon dioxide. And carbon uptake by land plants becomes degraded. And with continued emissions and continued warming, the projection is that 31% uptake of CO2 by plants is going to be cut in half in only 20 years. So this basically represents the failure of the land-based photosynthetic community because it's getting too warm. This effect is also not accounted for in national policies. An example is the Amazon. The Amazon contains more than half of all tropical rainforest, but it is logged, mined, hunted, deforested, dammed. There's drought, there's tree mortality because of the rising air temperature. And as a result of all this, the Amazon has lost 1/3 of all its biomass in the last decade. 1/3. And from 2010 to 2019, the Amazon basin gave off 18 billion tons of carbon dioxide, but only absorbed 15 billion tons. So it's now likely that the Amazon is a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. This paper just came out recently. Deforestation and global warming are pushing the Amazon past critical thresholds leading to forest dieback. This paper looked at satellite imagery over the last 2 decades, and it tracked the retreat of rainforest and the expansion of savanna or grasslands. Local fires and drought could tip into mega fires, deforestation and forest degradation. So deforestation is due to clearing for agriculture. Forest degradation is like what you see in the background here. That's drought killing trees in the Amazon. Has a feedback effect because evapotranspiration is when plants give off not only CO2, but also water. And the Amazon rainforest gives off so much water that it actually creates its own clouds, which then rain back on the Amazon. So the Amazon rainforest makes its own rain. And as we wipe it out for agriculture and the rainforest begins to die off because of heat and drought, less rain occurs, which creates this feedback effect of more drought. The Amazon rainforest is now taking longer to recover from drought. It used to take only 1 to 3 years, but now it's taking 3 to 5 years. And satellite evidence shows that 17% of the entire Amazon forest is gone. The Amazon is growing more arid. Drought events are increasing. Just this century, in the last 20 years, there have been 3 100-year drought events. So statistically deep, profound drought that should only occur once in a century, statistically speaking. There have been 3 of them. And on top of that, there's been a pronounced increase in human deforestation, fire, hunting, and damming. Models indicate that at 20% loss, just 3% more loss, that could lead to feedback-driven savanna formation. So you cut enough self-making rain that it just becomes an unstoppable feedback. The world is growing hotter, especially on land in the summer. This paper came out in May of last year. It tracks what's known as wet bulb temperature. That's the combination of heat and humidity. 120 degrees Fahrenheit temperature is bad, but 90 degrees Fahrenheit temperature can be worse if there's higher humidity, because humidity covers your skin in a thin blanket of moisture, preventing your body from dumping heat to the air. Our metabolism is basically a heat engine, and blood takes that heat, brings it up to our skin, and then that heat is lost through the skin to the air. But if you impede that release of heat by covering your skin with a little layer of moisture, humidity, your body begins to work harder and harder at releasing heat. And the blood moves towards your skin. That's why people become flushed. But that blood is being taken away from your organs. And you eventually can suffer heat disease in the form of organ failure because your organs aren't getting enough blood because it's taking all the blood towards your skin trying to offload heat. And there's a physiological limit to heat. It's 35 degrees Celsius as a wet bulb temperature. That's where a perfectly healthy human in the shade with all the drinking water that they want actually will not make it to the end of the day. They'll die from this combination of heat and humidity. And this extreme humid heat overall has more than doubled in frequency in the last 40 years. And now, globally, around the world, from 43 different countries, the statistics show that in the summertime, 37% of the heat-related deaths are due to climate change. We see papers emerging constantly on this theme: the emergence of heat and humidity too severe for human tolerance, escalating global exposure to compound heat-humidity extremes. Business as usual emissions will lead to super and ultra extreme heat waves. Deadly heat waves projected in the densely populated regions of South Asia. and this paper, The Future of the Human Climate Niche. So what this paper found was that today, 0.8% of the land surface is too hot for human existence. And that's shown in these black areas on the shores of the Red Sea and in the deep interior Sahara Desert. But at 3 degrees Celsius, which is our current pathway, 19% of the land surface will have these conditions. 1/5 of global land, all of India, all of Southeast Asia, Northern Australia, the Middle East, North Africa, huge parts of South America and Central America will all be too hot for human existence. At this point, with 1 degree Celsius of global warming, every additional degree C of warming is projected to displace an additional 1 billion people. So that by the time we get to 3 degrees Celsius warming, 1/3 of humanity will need to move because they are currently located in areas that are going to become too hot for human existence. Climate change and expanding human needs have led to water and food impacts. We are pulling most of our fresh water from aquifers in the ground, largely for agriculture purposes, for irrigation. But in the US, we are pulling 17% more water out of our aquifers than nature replenishes every year. In China, 22% more. India, 52% more. And in North Africa and the Middle East, thousands of percent more. So we are using up our aquifer sources of fresh water. And in 30 years, water demand is projected to grow by half. Already, 1/4 of humanity faces a looming water crisis every year. 17 nations are under extremely high water stress, meaning that they almost use all the water they have every year. And if you look here on the southern peninsula of India, the city of Chennai, this is a city of 10 million people that actually ran out of water 4 years ago. There are 4 huge reservoirs that feed this 10 million person city. They all ran dry in the summer of, I think it was 2018. So there are 4 fundamental cereals that feed humans. There's rice, wheat, corn, and soy. These are staples of human nutrition around the planet. And as the air contains more CO2, the plants that grow these get thicker stalks and waxier leaves, but the grain, the food portion, actually becomes less nutritious. Under higher CO2, those 4 cereals have up to 13% less protein, and it's replaced by carbohydrate. So these cereals are actually becoming more sugary. There's less zinc, less iron, and less vitamin B complex. If we look just at wheat, global wheat provides 20% of all human protein across the planet. The yield of wheat every year is threatened by drought, flood, and higher CO2. By 2050, the demand for wheat is projected to increase by 60%, but the actual yield is projected to decline by 15%. This is a recipe for food shortages and price spikes. By 2050, an additional 300 million people will be malnourished due to simply the climbing CO2 effect on the loss of micronutrients. And an additional 1.4 billion women and children are likely to have anemia or iron deficiency. Climate change could displace 216 million people by 2050, according to a report from the World Bank. This report came out late last year. It's called Groundswell Part 2. And they say that rising sea levels, water scarcity, declining crop productivity could force 216 million people to migrate just within their own countries by mid-century. And hotspots of displacement will emerge. Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, Latin America, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So these are examples of how climate change disrupts communities and causes them to be dislocated, creating a tide of refugees. This gets to the issue of global security. Even at scenarios of low warming, each region of the world will face severe risks to national and global security in the next 30 years. Higher levels of warming will pose catastrophic and likely irreversible global security risks over the course of the 21st century. This is from the Council on Strategic Risks in the US government. On top of this, the natural world and wild places are being sacrificed to human consumption. This paper, titled "Pervasive Human-Driven Decline of Life on Earth," points to the need for transformative change. Since 1970, the per-person consumption on this planet has increased by about 60%, and global economic activity has grown by 400%. Much of this growth has come at the expense of the natural world, which is now managed by us to keep up with rising demands for food, energy, timber, paper, minerals, hunting, and more. This paper describes this as an unparalleled appropriation of nature, causing the fabric of life on which humanity depends to fray and unravel. This paper just came out earlier this week. It reports that carbon loss from forests around the world has doubled in 20 years. From 2001 to 2005, the world's forests released almost 1 billion tons of carbon per year. Between 2015 and 2019, they released almost 2 billion tons of carbon per year. 82% of this forest carbon loss results from the need to feed ourselves. It results from human agriculture. And what it says is that the acceleration and high rate of forest carbon loss in the 21st century suggests that existing strategies to reduce forest loss are not successful. Carbon loss from forests comes from wildfire, drought, flat out deforestation in order to grow food and palm oil and other food materials. Despite having United Nations programs in stopping deforestation and international programs across the board to deal with this problem, this paper proves that they're not effective. Since 1970, food crop production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. In 2019, the rate of deforestation was 1 football field every 6 seconds, and more than half of this was to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. 43% of all ice and desert-free land, 2/3 of all freshwater use on this planet is for food production. Over 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces just 18% of food calories and 37% of protein. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of available land surface on this planet, 16% of all available fresh water. And 1/3 of worldwide grain production goes to feed cows so that we can go to McDonald's and have a cheeseburger. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than producing plant-based human food. The result of this is that 86% of all land mammals are now cows or people. Of all birds, 70% are chickens or other forms of human food. Human overconsumption, population growth, and intensive farming has destroyed 68% of vertebrate wildlife on this planet since 1970. This has led to the era of releasing pathogens from their natural equilibrium. 335 new infectious diseases have emerged in recent decades. 60% of new pathogens and 75% of new or emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning that they jump from animals to humans. Ebola, HIV, malaria, West Nile, anthrax, encephalitis, Zika, SARS, MERS, COVID-19 is the most recent. These are called spillover events, when microbes carried by animals cross over to humans through our contact. There are 4 general venues for spillover events. One is habitat loss. Roughly 1/3 of new zoonotic diseases are directly attributed to deforestation and habitat destruction. 40% of the world's original forests have been eliminated. Only 2.9% of Earth's land surface remains faunally intact. The second venue is extreme weather events. Flood, wildfire, and heat displace humans and pathogens. Human immune systems are weakened during extreme weather events, and disease is a major problem following disasters. The third spillover venue is vector expansion. The tropics are expanding. Mice, mosquitoes, ticks, deer, and other carriers are moving into human communities that had not seen them before. We're also killing off the apex species, and the small rodents are expanding. They tend to be the main vectors or carriers of disease. And so as we kill off and hunt out the apex species, mice and all types of small rodents are expanding, and they have the added attribute of being able to quickly assimilate themselves in human communities. They live behind the scenes in human communities. And so we come in touch with them constantly without actually realizing it. They run across the surfaces of our homes at night when we don't see it, and then we go and use those surfaces. That's just one example. The fourth venue is where we grow thousands of chickens or hundreds of cows and pigs in concentrated animal feeding operations. These are breeding grounds for pathogenesis. In nature, a pathogen cannot afford to kill its host. A virus that is so deadly that it constantly kills its host will eventually go out of business. And so in nature, there's a natural selection for less virulent pathogens. But when you're in a farm factory and you pull out the dead animals and replace them with live animals, virulent pathogens grow more deadly because there's no evolutionary pressure to suppress that virulence. And so these are breeding grounds for virulent pathogens. Pork, poultry, and beef, in fact, under these conditions are kept alive by pumping them with antibiotics. Nearly 2/3 of the drugs important to human medicine in the US are sold for food animal use to keep them alive in these factory farms. And this, of course, leads to the rise of bacterial resistance in humans, where we have trouble treating bacterial infections because we are selecting for superbacteria that are resistant to antibacterial drugs. All of these, disease, environmental damage, climate change, and human inequality, form an amplifying feedback. Disadvantaged groups suffer disproportionately, resulting in greater inequality. The ratio between the income of the richest and poorest 10% on this planet is 25% wider than it would be in a world without global warming. This is the history of CO2 release since 1850. And this is what CO2 release history has to be in the future. We have to have 0 emissions of carbon dioxide within 30 years. In order to hit the 2 degrees Celsius target, we get an additional 15 years. This means a 40 to 50% reduction in CO2 by 2030. And we need to remove CO2 from the air for the rest of the century, and in fact, beyond that. This is the pivotal decade for humanity. This decade. And I would argue we're lucky to be here because this is our time to do something about this. We have a job to do. And right now is when it needs to be done. How do we stop warming? A zero emissions electric grid. Existing fossil fuel infrastructure has to be decommissioned before its lifetime. Our transportation systems have to be emissions free. Aviation, shipping, and ground transportation. We need zero emission buildings. Within 8 years, 1/3 to 1/2 of all buildings on this planet need to be retrofitted for energy efficiency and converted to clean energy. We need an agriculture revolution. Ag is the largest individual sector of emissions. And it turns out a high beef diet increases your statistical chance of developing cancer. Eating beef is bad for you. So this should be a no-brainer if we want to take care of our health. Reducing animal meat consumption and increasing plant-based proteins is good for us. It's good for the planet, and it's a solution to climate change. We need a focus on sustainable food production. And we need to get away from extractive agriculture where the soil is not viewed as a carbon storage medium, and into regenerative agriculture where you use cover crops, you stop tilling the soil, and you protect the carbon in the soil. And in fact, you can enhance the carbon in the soil. This is called regenerative agriculture. So a new type of soil conservation. We need zero emissions industry, green investment. Last year, or in 2020, there was a $900 billion investment in various green efforts. That needed to be 2.75 trillion. But one of the bright lights is the investment community is turning strongly towards this problem. And we may reach $2 trillion of wealth investment by 2025. So the investment community is finally being, leaders are stepping forward saying, look, profits won't do us any good if the planet's dead. So we're finally seeing the response from the investment community. And we need social tipping points, right? It's social tipping points that taught my generation to drive with seatbelts, and that taught my children's generation to not drive and drink, to identify, the designated driver when my kids go out in the evening. Those are social tipping points. We need a social tipping point where society recognizes the immoral nature of fossil fuel. The consumer economy needs to transition to a circular economy, a reuse economy, and every part of society has to experience transformational change. So I'll end with this quote. I think it's from Lord of the Rings. We don't choose the times we live in. The only choice we have is how we respond. And I think I've left some time for questions. So thanks for your attention. And I'll stop sharing. And Hannah said that she would moderate for questions. So I'm open for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a few questions ready for you.
That's good news.
Yeah, I think just segueing directly from talking about solutions to stop warming at 1.5 Celsius, someone asked, does all of that need to be done by 2030? What's the timeline look like for those sort of changes?
All of those changes need to be well underway. And I'll tell you that all of those professions, so the architecture profession, the community design profession, the farming profession, all of the professionals in those communities are beginning to mobilize. They're beginning to move. It would have been great 20 years ago. And it's kind of late for 1.5. It's, in my opinion, it's too late for 2.0, but it is happening. I think we have moved beyond the phase of, I wish people would get it, into the phase of, I wish people would get how severe it is.
I don't know if we can just jump in as well, but just to follow up while we're on that topic, things like electric cars, for instance, wouldn't be net zero, right? Or am I wrong on that? So
Well,
we would
the
go even farther.
electricity, if you're charging your electric car with renewable energy, if you're using solar power to charge your car,
Okay.
and if you, I mean, if you really want to do cradle to grave, you want to look at every component of your electric vehicle, and you want to see what is the carbon footprint, including shipping from where they were manufactured, assembled, and then sold to you. We do need to get to that point. But right now, we're just trying to move to the stage where people are driving electric cars and they're charging them with sunlight and solar and other forms of renewable energy.
Thank you.
Someone was curious about the drop in emissions in 2020 related to the COVID pandemic and recession, and if you have any insight into what the particular biggest contributors to those drops were.
Yeah, the shutdown, I mean, the recession. So dissecting it further than that, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but there are analyses that looked at the coal, petroleum, natural gas components of carbon dioxide emissions. I can tell you that coal is roaring back to life. As of the second half of last decade, and by 2019, coal was on its way out, but unfortunately, now it's on its way back. Coal is being seen by India, China, and a number of other nations as the sort of quick opportunity to grab energy. Let me say that it's not the European Union and it's not the United States. It's not the Northern Hemisphere developed countries that are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the developing world. It's the world that wants modern hospitals, modern education systems, modern transportation, modern technology, and they deserve to have it. And it's not fair for the developed world to turn to the developing world and say, you guys are not allowed to improve the quality of your life, the medical care in your life, all these other aspects that we are enjoying in the developed world. So while the developing world is the primary source of greenhouse gases, it's actually fair. What needs to happen is the developed world needs to jump in with the developing world and outfit them with renewable energy. I like to think of it as the mobilization that happened in the US for World War II. Within 6 months, the automobile industry had completely pivoted and were producing tanks and Jeeps. Every aspect of US economy and society was focused on the fact that they were in World War II. Today is a war to save the planet. And I see the US Armed Forces as a giant workforce that we should deploy across the world. We should turn our manufacturing towards producing the material used in renewable energy. And the developed world needs to go out and assist the developing world in leveling out human equity. So that's where the issue is. And that is why it's so difficult at the COPs to come to agreement. The story is crystal clear. We're in a world of hurt. Why is it that we can't all agree to fix it? The reason is the developing world sees a great inequity has been done in that they want to come back, they want to rise to become a modern economy, and they deserve the benefits that go with that. So they fight against some of the language because it would keep them down, if you would. It would prevent them from rising to the level of health that the developed world has. Those were very broad statements. There are lots of little details in there, but overall, that's my view of what's happening.
Appreciate that. Thanks. I think the particular question about the pandemic and drop in emissions was looking at like, was that related to transportation ceasing or particular sectors or uses?
It's really everything. I mean,
yeah,
we were all locked down.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Kind of just a cease in activity in all sectors. Yeah.
I wrote that question. Sorry to be annoying with follow-ups, but in one of our classes, one of the like branch off materials said that like energy inclusive of residential home energy was one of the highest emitters. So that's kind of where I was wondering like how that fit in, because I would imagine like our residential home energy usage went up.
Yeah. So again, I don't have those details, but they're easily available. I would point you towards the International Energy Agency, IEA, and they have a pathway to 2050. That's a great document. And believe it or not, British Petroleum comes out with an annual report on global energy. They have a lot of good details. There's also the Carbon Project, I think it's called. They have details. In fact, I have slides in another talk which show exactly the petroleum, coal, and other types of fossil fuels, and also the sectors that you're referring to, transportation, et cetera, which sectors went up and down over 2021. So that information is available. Global Carbon Project, that's what it's called.
Thank you so much.
Going in a different direction, folks are curious about social tipping points and where you see this needing to happen, where you're optimistic in terms of social tipping points. If you could speak more to that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's no longer about ABC News and seeing a commercial about climate change, right? No one watches ABC News. No one watches traditional TV writ large. People communicate through apps, and we should all be communicating on this subject of not only climate change, but biodiversity loss, pandemics, human inequality, pollution. It begins with being informed. And so I'm on a number of daily email listservs. There are lots of new media companies out there who will deliver into your inbox every morning the headlines related to any of these subjects. And you know, you can go through them, and if your particular interest is the collapse of the East Antarctic ice shelves or heat waves hitting the breadbaskets of the world, whatever your interest is, when you find one of those articles and you know, you feel it's in your wheelhouse, tweet it back out, send it back out to people. And I have found that those who are sources of climate information are seeking other people who are sources of climate information, and these circles coagulate and become larger and larger. So that is how we move towards creating social tipping points, where finally everybody is talking about these issues. Don't think to yourself that when you read a headline, oh, all my other friends are reading it as well. Don't think that. Take that headline and push it out. It's very effective. And LinkedIn, Twitter, I've done one TikTok so far. They take a little bit more work.
I'm gonna have to find that for sure. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more. So I think definitely your message about the need for carbon removal came through, because we've got a few questions about that. And so curious what your thoughts are about technological versus natural carbon sequestration, or both. And if there are any promising technologies that you want to speak to specifically.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, this is not about planting trees. It's not about growing forests. The first 20 years of a forest, it's actually a source of greenhouse gas. And you take your average old growth forest, over 60% of the carbon is in the soil. It's the soil that is the source or the sink of carbon. There are all sorts of co-benefits that come along with planting trees. I'm not against planting trees. We're going to need the shade, and eventually those trees will become important carbon sinks. But this is an emergency. You know, planting trees could have been the solution 40 years ago. Now we need more immediate concerns. A big thing is jet fuel. So you can pull CO2 out of the air, and if you combine it with green hydrogen, so green hydrogen would be hydrogen taken from either urea or water, where that electrolysis process is powered by renewable energy, and your direct air capture is powered by renewable energy. You take the CO2, you crack that molecule and produce CO, carbon monoxide, plus your hydrogen, you have a hydrocarbon. You can make any fuel, any internal combustion engine fuel you want. You can make aviation fuel, Jet A, Jet B, gasoline, diesel fuel. And so instead of using, here in Hawaii, up until next week, we got our oil from tankers from Libya and Russia. And now we're cutting off the Russian source, and we're getting our oil in Hawaii from Alaska and from Libya. Instead of doing that and refining it to make gasoline or aviation fuel, and especially Hawaii, which is a tourism-based economy requiring international travel, I'm arguing here locally to get rid of our refinery and use a direct air capture. It's called the Fischer-Tropsch process, green hydrogen, carbon monoxide. That will also, as the global economy begins to collapse and Hawaii becomes increasingly isolated, there will still be wealthy communities in the world who want to travel to Hawaii. So as we become more isolated and dependent on our own resources, we can still entertain a green tourism economy by using this synthetic fuel. Now, yes, you burn your synthetic fuel, it goes back in the air, and there's no net sequestration taking place, but you're no longer adding carbon to the air. You are using the carbon that's already in the air for your feedstock. Eventually, aviation is going to turn to hydrogen or electricity. And we already have planes flying inter-island in Hawaii that are electrical, that are powered by battery. Pretty soon we'll have intercontinental aviation. I shouldn't say soon, it may be 10 years at least, maybe more like 20 or 30 years. At that point, your direct air capture machinery can convert to taking that CO2 and injecting it into the ground as a pure sequestration exercise. And if one of these synthetic fuel facilities was located at every major airport in the world, and if the whole world moved quickly over to synthetic fuel, this would have a very important effect. It could also begin to kickstart the fabled green tourism, right? The sustainable tourism, which is, like I said, it's fabled. But it begins with what's your carbon footprint when you fly.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer. I think we've got to cut it there. We are at time, folks, but thank you so much for your great questions. Sorry if we did not get to yours. And a big thank you to Chip again for being here.
Thanks, you guys. You're doing the right thing. Stay on it. Happy to entertain any questions if you want to hit me by email.
Take care, all. Thanks. I'm
Take
going to
care.
end it
Stay
there.
safe.